In 2022, I read more books than I ever have. And instead of focusing on reading quantity, I focused on reading quality. This meant slowing down, relentlessly annotating, and truly absorbing as much as I could from every single book I read. So in today's video, I want to give a summary of every book I read, as well as some of the lessons I learned from each one. So grab a coffee and let's get started. So the first book up is Your Next 5 Moves by Patrick Bet-David. In his book, Patrick Bet-David leverages stories and experiences from his past as he gives advice to aspiring entrepreneurs, active business owners, and then the regular 9-to-5 employee as well. He talks about defining who you are and where you want to go, especially when it comes to knowing how you're going to get there, as far as are you going to be an entrepreneur, or as he describes, an entrepreneur working within a company. He also talks about responsibility, managing personnel, being prepared for crises, scaling the business, and a lot more within this book. So if you are an aspiring entrepreneur, or just a regular employee and looking for ways to work up within the business that you're at, highly recommend this book, especially when it comes to mindset. Next up is The Laws of Human Nature by Robert Greene. He does a deep dive on psychology, how we act and think and behave, and also how others act, think, and behave with us. So he goes into mastering our emotions, empathizing with others, how to tell if somebody's presenting a mask and lying to you, all kinds of different things. And if you've read any Robert Greene books in the past, you know he uses a lot of historical references and characters throughout to explain each law, which I tend to like because I'm a big fan of history. So if you are into that stuff and you're looking into human psychology, definitely give this a read. Next up is Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. Now, this book is extremely popular for various reasons and for good reason, but also primarily because of Ryan Holiday. His work and his books talks about Stoicism and specifically Marcus Aurelius a lot. So there's a lot of hype behind this book. And I do think it has great application, especially if you are into Stoicism and into kind of muting the emotions, controlling your emotions, your urges, your desires, and all of that. So that's what Marcus talks about in this. And I will say Marcus Aurelius plays a pretty unique role in history because he was the leader of the Roman Empire, but at the same time was very aware of his mortality, was very concerned with ethics, with virtue, and things of that nature. So if you are looking to get a good entry into philosophy, into ethics, into Stoicism specifically, and how to control your emotions, work through hardship, and still pursue on through life and find meaning, Meditations is the book. Next up is The Will to Power by Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, in this book, it's a little bit different than his traditional works because it was published posthumously by his sister, but it does still contain a lot of his journal entries and ideas that were later or earlier published in the books that he wrote. So you still get a ton of criticism of Christian and Judeo-Christian values, especially when it comes to morality. He talks about nihilism in this book and how he's, denying it and against it because he's basically an existentialist, which in simplest terms, he finds value and meaning in the individual, and the individual defining their own values, asserting their dominance, asserting their power, trying to work and achieve more in life. That's the meaning in his eyes that man has. That's man's sole purpose, is will to power, to assert and find his maximized potential, essentially. So if you're looking to kind of get an introduction into Nietzsche, is really no perfect place to start. I don't know if this is the book, but this is where I started. And it gives you a good broad overview of a lot of the underlying themes that Nietzsche has throughout his works. So following along the Nietzsche train, we have Beyond Good and Evil. And this book basically sets up Nietzsche's main arguments that he later explores in other works as well when it comes to morality. So he doesn't believe in a greater good or common good, especially when it comes to the moral values that are associated with Christian values and scripture. In the book, he argues that naturally and historically, we've always seen stronger, greater, aggressive men take leadership roles. They always become the ruling class just because of their nature of asserting themselves in society. And then everyone else just becomes the common or lower class. And this ends up setting up the master versus slave morality systems that he explores in the next book I'll talk about. But this is a good kind of basis for where his criticisms really lie within morality, and sets a good foundation for which he explores in the next book, which is On the Genealogy of Morals, which, as I mentioned earlier, sets up the conflict of slave morality and master morality. Now, the terms might be a little bit aggressive in today's culture, but basically what he's setting up is master morality is what we've had in most historical contexts and throughout history, basically, to where the ruling class, the powerful class, the nobles, whatever they are, They define themselves as good because of their righteousness, their money, their wealth, their power, whatever it is. And then by virtue of them being the good, the lower folk or poor people are looked at as bad. But there is this shift that happens in history due to what Nietzsche describes as Judeo-Christian values and this movement, where there's a reversal of valuation, a reversal of roles essentially, to where slave morality asserts the inversion, where instead of asserting good and then deducing the bad from that, the slave morality states this, that the lower class defines the powerful, the oppressive as bad and evil specifically, and because they're evil, the lower class must be good and righteous. Now this kind of sets up a more herd morality, a public good, which again Nietzsche is very against. So you can see kind of where he's going from with this. And it also criticizes the individual. So any individual that is kind of asserting that will to power, asserting dominance, asserting leadership, they're going to be kind of pushed to the side or cast with a bad conscience, with guilt that religion essentially ties to the individual for trying to assert themselves above others. So that's on the genealogy of morals. Nietzsche can be a tough read, which leads me to the next book I read by Nietzsche, which was Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Now I'm going to be honest with you. I didn't get a ton out of this book. Now, thank God I read the other books first because they were more to the point, at least as far as Nietzsche is concerned. But Thus Spoke Zarathustra is essentially a collection of narrative stories that follow this character Zarathustra. And the stories can be a little bit difficult to interpret, a little bit difficult to explain. But a lot of the same ideas of will to power, of this Übermensch, this greater man, basically this Superman as Nietzsche kind of describes, all those underlying themes that Nietzsche discusses in other books are right here in this, what most people term as a masterpiece. It's difficult to read, so I'll have to reread this along with all of his books, to be honest. So I would not start with this if you're getting into Nietzsche, but Thus Spoke Zarathustra, that was the next book I read. So at this point of my philosophical journey, I wanted to take some steps back and get to the origins of Western philosophy and kind of work my way up through some of the major texts in history. Now, I've read Plato in the past, so I didn't start with the Republic, but I did get to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. This was one of my favorite books of the year, just because it encompasses so much, from happiness to virtues to justice to politics, friendships. It's chock full of really good stuff. And I advise, if you are getting into philosophy and need a beginner book, this is a good place to start. I'd even probably advise this maybe over Plato. And it sets a lot of the foundations for other philosophies and other books that come down the line. So when it comes to lessons that I took from this book, one primary one was that virtue is a mean. So if we look at courage as a virtue, if we have deficiency of courage, that would be cowardice. If we have excess, that would be brashness. Arrogance, neither is good. So Aristotle's like, we don't want excess or deficiency of any virtue. We want to find it within the mean, which isn't necessarily the middle. Another key point that I took away a lot from this was when he discussed friendships and how we don't want them in pleasure or utility, because the usefulness can dissipate, right? And then you have this imbalance of friendship where maybe one friend is giving more than you're giving to them, and they're just bound to dissolve. Really, you want friendships based in virtue, where you share the values and beliefs with that same person, and your belief is more rooted in, loving the person rather than what they can give or do for you. Next up, I read The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli, and this book is a little interesting. So it was actually written as a gift to an upcoming prince of Italy, and he wrote it with a lot of kind of strategy built into politics. So he talks about, organizing your militia. He talks about you would rather be feared than loved by the people because fear will instill more obedience. But hatred will actually create resentment and more revolt. So it's a very politically driven book. It's a fascinating read. It's not too long as well. So if you are interested into kind of politics, and especially when it comes to leaders throughout history and throughout that time period, The Prince is a good place to start. Next up is a thin but very important book when it comes to philosophy, and that is Rene Descartes' Discourse on Method and Meditations on First Philosophy. Descartes is very fixated and focused on knowledge and on rationality and reason. He believes that we set ourselves apart from animals for our capacity for reason. And he thinks through reason we can know everything. So what he essentially tries to do through the Discourse on Method is she wants to create a scientific method to where we can know everything about existence, about metaphysics, about God, through reason and rationality. And then he later goes on to argue for the existence of God, as well as the human soul being separate from the body and an infinite being itself. And I will mention that typically these books are separated, the Discourse on Method and Meditations on First Philosophy, but you can buy them grouped together like this on Amazon, so I'd highly recommend picking up this Hackett edition so that you can get both books in one. Next up is Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. Now this is a must-read for anyone getting into politics, political theory, government, philosophy, any of that. It's dense, but it's very important because it lays the framework for a lot of theories and political ideas that come down later down the line. Now, it's important to note that Hobbes is writing this book around the time of the English Civil War, and he's experiencing chaos, basically. There's no government, and people are just at each other's necks, and it's reckless, it's unstable, it's unsafe. And because of this, he argues that society will naturally agree to give up their rights to an absolute sovereign in return for safety and security and the things that government can provide. Now, he ends up advocating primarily for a monarchy, but regardless of monarchy, oligarchy, democracy, whatever it is, he believes that people have to stay obedient to this government. The government needs absolute control and power, or else it's not really going to be a sustainable source of security in the long run. So if you're looking to explore political theory, especially when it comes to Western governments and how they were formed and a lot of the ideas they drew from, Leviathan's a great place to start off at. Now, next up, I deviated a little bit from the philosophy I was reading and fast forward to Ayn Rand's The Virtue of Selfishness. Now, Ayn Rand is a very controversial, hated, and just distinct figure in history, and understandably so. She is very polarizing for a certain reason. It's because she advocates for selfishness, which we esteem either through religious pretext or not. We view selfishness as a bad thing, as evil, as you're out for yourself. You don't care about others. Now, she tries to argue that it's not necessarily a bad thing. She basically puts the preservation of life and one's own personal interests as the highest value. That I should look out for myself first and foremost, and that is the most reasonable, rational thing to do. She advocates for individualism and doesn't think it's someone's duty to sacrifice or risk their own life in the service of someone else. She thinks that if you are going to act altruistically, that you should do so out of your own interest, your own, personal choice, and that it shouldn't be a moral duty or requirement to do so. Now, she argues these very aggressively, very boldly, and sometimes makes these fairly inaccurate assertions about people or about certain habits or behaviors. But regardless, I think some of her ideas are very worth listening to and worth reading, even if you disagree with them. So that is Ayn Rand's Virtue of Selfishness. And it's not really a book, it's a collection of essays that she and Nathaniel Braden have written, all collected into one book. Back to traditional philosophy, I have the Theological-Political treatise by Spinoza. And in this book, he gives an exegesis on Scripture as a whole, specifically the Old Testament, and also criticizes the current religious leaders and church that he's experiencing at the time. Now, in his society, he's experiencing a situation where church and state are kind of tied together, and also there's this very strict and stringent view on Scripture. So what he tries to do is broaden out how one can interpret and freely analyze Scripture. So throughout the work, he's looking at the prophets and why they were chosen by God and ordained by God. He's looking at the factual basis, how do we know that these things actually occurred? What is the relevance of them? Things of that nature. And overall, what he does is, religious or not, he says that we should all be free and able to examine the moral teachings, the moral lessons in the Bible, in Scripture, and apply them however we choose, whether we hold them as factual truths and they're guiding us to God and our love for God, or whether we just take the moral teachings as separate from a theological view and just say, hey, these ideas of not killing your neighbor and loving thy neighbor and not murdering, so forth, blah, 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 taking care of your parents, things of those nature. Those moral teachings from the commandments within the Old Testament, we can have those views without actually believing in God or following the church as well. So essentially, he advocates for broadening out interpretation of Scripture and also for separation of the church and the state. Next up on the list is Pensees by Blaise Pascal, and this book is pretty interesting. Just like Meditations, it's a collection of essays, notes, and entries that Pascal wrote and then was later published posthumously. And it's a little bit all over the place, but at the same time, there's still some underlying themes, especially when it comes to God. Pascal was a Christian, and so there's a lot of talk about this wager between believing in God's existence or the ignorance of it, and morality and death and things like that. But there's also tons of applicable life lessons, I think, sprinkled throughout here that are pretty interesting. So I definitely would advise give this a read, give this a look. Again, you can kind of bounce around throughout this book. There are some coherent ideas that lead on, but a good examination of metaphysics, of human psychology and behavior and society and culture, and even a little bit of religion as well throughout. So back to Spinoza, we have his famous Ethics. And as much as this book is called Ethics, he does touch on ethics, but it's more at the end. This book is primarily about reality, about existence, about God, and it's written in a very interesting way. It's written in a geometrical type of way. So he breaks down definitions and axioms and then deduces these propositions and truths from them. So it's written in a strange way that can be hard to follow along. I struggled for a while reading this, but over time, staying patient, annotating the hell out of it, I was able to get most of the main concepts out of it. And one primary concept is this idea of God as synonymous with nature, the cosmos, the universe. And he thinks that all of existence originated from a first cause. And that first cause can be God for you, it can be the cosmos, it can be just nature. And then everything originated from that original substance out of necessity and out of, a deterministic way. So he has this deterministic view on nature, on life, that everything happens, how it's going to happen, out of necessity. And so we don't have free will. We do what we're going to do as nature predetermines, basically. And that leads him down the road of, when it comes to ethics, that these ideas of good and evil are just these purely subjective notions. And not that we should just do away with them, but more that they are essentially guidance and a path for us towards a more desirable model of human nature. So we use ethics to kind of guide society's behavior toward to a way that advantages us down the road. Another key notion he points out is the separation between the body and the mind. The mind as being thought and the body as extension. And this theory is built off of and examined and criticized and analyzed by other philosophers down the road. So it's important to get this distinction of body as extension and thought as mind. And I do think it's pretty interesting, although he doesn't believe in a God, he does talk about the mind as being infinite. The mind is infinite, it has always existed, and the body is finite and obviously perishes with time, with duration. But it is pretty interesting, this idea of the mind as being infinite, kind of like the idea of soul. But anyway, difficult read, but very valuable read nonetheless. Next up, we have the second treatise of government from John Locke. Now, if you're like me and you're American, Locke probably rings a bell because you heard about him a ton in school, and that's because his work and his ideas were so important to the founding fathers who created America. And a lot of these ideas center around freedom of each individual citizen and right of property and life. And he argues that although we have these natural rights in society, we give up these rights to a government, to a commonwealth, similar to Hobbes, as Hobbes describes in Leviathan. We voluntarily give up these rights in return for safety, security, and stability which a government can provide, and they instill these laws to make sure people follow them, and they provide peace in society. And without peace and without a government, we have this, again, natural state of human nature, where it's chaotic, brutish, short, and so forth. So Locke describes we have these natural freedoms and these rights, we give them up to the government, and all is happy and well. But we have this right to revolt, and this is an important idea because if the government isn't upholding their end of operating in your best interest, of upholding your rights, then you should revolt to the government. And that's important because America ends up revolting against British forces, and as well as the French Revolution eventually occurs as well, where the people of France are revolting against the king. And so a lot of those ideas originate from John Locke. And the last book I read, which was one of my favorites for the year, was Fear and Trembling by Soren Kierkegaard. Now, this book is beautifully written. Maybe it's just me, but I really enjoy the way that Kierkegaard verbalizes faith, how he describes it, the different stories. Just his way of writing is enjoyable to read. And his concept of faith really grabbed me, especially as, you know, someone who does value individualism, who has been an entrepreneur. He talks about this leap of faith. And his concept of faith isn't just a religious sense, although Kierkegaard was Christian, and you know, a lot of the stories within this book center around the story of Abraham and Isaac in Scripture. But the concept of faith supersedes just the theological sense. It can be a passion, it can be a love, a value, something that you hold as the most important thing, your meaning, your purpose. And so he thinks that he creates these depictions of a night of infinite resignation, a night of faith. Essentially, these characters hold this faith as their utmost value. It's more important than anything else in their life. And even if they can't achieve that faith, even if they're going to fail, he references this idea of loving a woman that you can never actually be with. But you still find purpose and meaning and joy and happiness through that passion, through this image of having that woman or of having that passion or that love that you have, these feeling towards. So it's a difficult concept. I'm obviously not perfect at articulating it, but well worth a reread on my end and a read on your end. Good ideas throughout this book, and it kind of again sets up some individualistic ideas or existential ideas that are later built upon by some 19th and 20th century writers as well. So that's all the books I read in 2022, and 2023 is a big year for me. I have a lot of challenging books, especially as I continue to work my way through Western philosophy. So I'll be taking you guys along the journey for some of these texts and hopefully sharing those ideas. But let me know, what was your favorite book in 2022? Comment down below and let me know. Maybe I can add it to my list for 2023. But anyway, like the video if you guys enjoyed it. Subscribe for more content. Let me know what your thoughts are and if you read some of the books that I read as well. And I'll catch you guys in the next one.